Venezuela is a democratic country with no runaway inflation, no collapsing health services, no population flight. That's what incumbent Nicolas Maduro told France 24's Marc Perelman in a free-ranging interview ahead of next Sunday's presidential poll. His main rivals, they're either boycotting or behind bars. Maduro insists his is a democratic country. He admits Venezuela does have economic problems, but blames them, as you're about to hear, on outside forces, mainly the United States and neighboring Colombia. So how should the international community respond? In particular, Venezuela's neighbors. What happens after Sunday's poll? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Maduro's Venezuelan, and with us, Venezuelan sculptor and photographer Cristobal Ochoa. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Joining us from the United States, Venezuelan-American lawyer and journalist Eva Gollinger, the author of The Chavez Code, and from Chicago, Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, who teaches at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. Welcome to both of you. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Before we turn to our panel, let's turn to France 24's Marc Perelman, who interviewed Nicolas Maduro. Before I ask you about that, you were in Caracas for a week. How does Venezuela seem to you today?
It's getting worse every time I go there. The situation is worse and worse. We're seeing some cash on this table right now. There's no cash in Caracas anymore. People don't have cash. They are lacking.
It's a barter economy?
It's essentially a barter economy, and there's a lack of food, there's a lack of medicine, there's hyper inflation. And the big difference between this time, the last time I was there, is the lack of cash, but also the fact that Venezuelans are leaving. And that's really a new fact. And this was also one of the questions I asked to the president. We'll see what he has to say about that. But clearly, this is a very tense situation on a social economic level. Politically, compared to a year ago, where we saw really protest and violent repression, the situation is kind of an eerie calm, maybe before the storm, because most of the opposition doesn't want to participate in the elections. It calls a sham. But there are some candidates, and Nicolas Maduro is going ahead despite mounting threats about regime change coming from Washington, from countries in the region. So it's very kind of surreal situation that you have essentially a country collapsing economically and politically. No one knows what will happen after next Sunday.
Well, how did he seem to you when you sat down? Tell us about the circumstances under which you sat down with the Venezuelan president.
Well, it was a long and difficult pursuit to get this interview. It's been years trying. And even there, I stayed a week, and it was really, I was waiting for the date, the hour. There were a few false alarms, if I may say, but eventually the interview took place at the airport where he was about to leave for a campaign event like he does every day since the last few weeks. And so this is where it happened.
All right, Marc Perelman, many thanks. And here it is then. Marc, sit down with the president of Venezuela.
Hello and welcome to Caracas for an exclusive interview with the president of Venezuela, Mr. Nicolas Maduro. Thank you very much.
Hello.
Mr. President, from the United States of America, we have heard some very tough language against Venezuela and against you personally. The ambassador of the United States at the United Nations has declared it's high time Mr. Maduro should give up power. The Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, has said the government of the United States will not stay inactive. And the President of Colombia, Mr. Santos, has said that a change of regime will occur soon. What's happening?
An offensive which was prepared with a view to the possibility that in Venezuela there might be a positive outcome, as will be the case during the forthcoming presidential elections. This has created a form of pressure on the countries. This is not something which is new. We have seen 3 presidents of the US come and go: Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and now we have Donald Trump. Each one of them had their approach to Venezuela, but the official policy of the imperialistic United States with regard to the Bolivarian Revolution was to subject it to pressure and to try and effect regime change. Now we've got Donald Trump. Now we've got an extreme right approach. The extreme right there, the Ku Klux Klan. We're persecuted by Ku Klux Klan.
I'd like to understand. The president of Bolivia has stated that it's not only pressures we're talking or about a possible military invasion.
This will never happen. I can guarantee you that.
He says there's a plan for a military invasion. Do you have any information on this? After the presidential elections?
You can be certain that the extremists are reaching levels of madness which are exceptional, as the statements against Venezuela, threats, including Donald Trump during August last from his residence in Miami, who had stated that the military option had not been completely abandoned as far as Venezuela was concerned. You can be certain that they are envisaging all forms of madness. You can be certain of this because they extremists from the extreme right. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I'm talking about the Ku Klux Klan operating against Venezuela, but the geopolitical situation, the strength of the Bolivarian Revolution, this multipolar world in which we live means that an option like this cannot be ruled out.
Are you afraid of a military coup? Several military officers have been arrested recently. There are rumors according to which there may be a coup d'etat.
That's what the United States government would like.
Is this are you saying that lightly, or is it serious?
Well, I'm stating this because we have, over the last 5 years, we've dismantled several groups which have attempted to set up this kind of operation in Venezuela, in the embassy and so on. And that's part of the tradition of the United States. You can imagine in the 20th century in Latin America, century of invasions and
But we're in the 21st century now.
But nothing has changed for imperialism because they continue to see us as their backyard, unfortunately. It's difficult to understand for the rest of the world or in Europe, but you have to understand that the Monroe Doctrine, which stated that America was the Americans, refers to the United States. We are for them, we're Martians, we're not Americans for them. But we are, of course, South Americans, Latin Americans. But the Monroe Doctrine was very vigorous at the time and was established throughout the 19th century, during the 20th century. And it seemed that with Barack Obama, at one point, we might have envisaged a change. There might have been a new relationship between the elites which were governing the U.S. from Washington, the peoples of Latin America. But that has not been the case. But ultimately, what is happening has come from the legacy of Barack Obama against Venezuela.
Aren't you afraid of a military coup?
Well, we don't act upon our fears. We act with regard to certainties. If the government of the United States attempted a putsch, you can be certain there will be a counter-putsch. A civil military putsch will be just as strong as took place in April in 2002. They already attempted a putsch. You may remember on the 11th of April 2002 with Hugo Chavez, they ousted him for 47 hours. They sequestered him and they tried to exfiltrate him. But who saved him? The people and the military. You can be convinced of the total loyalty of the people and the military to the Bolivarian Revolution. We have the people are very close to the army and vice versa. And if, as a result of Washington's maneuverings,
as regards the elections, you are aiming to get 10 million votes in the election. This has never happened before.
This is an objective, let's say.
Yes, it's an objective. The citizens obviously don't have to obey that objective. You've never reached that level, not even when Mr. Chavez was in power.
You know, this is a battle objective order, and it's a debt for the Venezuelans who can understand it. It's something that's in their hearts. 10 million votes, that would be like with Chavez, this historical objective of the Venezuelan people that enter into this electoral battle with this passion, with this people's enthusiasm. The people will once again reclaim the flame, and with people saying 10 million, we're talking about a debt here. Now, whatever you think there'll be a landslide victory.
There's a problem. The international community, the countries in the region, the United States, Canada, Europe, have stated that they are not going to recognize those elections.
You're talking about your international community.
The Lima Group, the European Union.
But what about the rest of the world? You've got the United Nations, you've got 150 or so countries. This international community is not that of Washington in its alliance with some right-leaning governments from Europe or from Latin America. The international community is represented by the people of the world. So let us not endorse what your international community is iterating and reiterating.
It's not only the right-wing governments. The governments of the left in Europe state that in France, for example, the government says, Mr. Macron...
On the left, Macron, on the left, on the right, neoliberal. He's in the process of destroying France. He's on the ultra-right. You can see he's stripping away workers' rights. He's privatizing public companies and transport. How can you say that Macron is not of the right? He is known as representing the interests of the bankers, the richest people in France.
But some people assert that the elections won't be transparent in Venezuela. The opposition has been invalidated, have been exiled, imprisoned, and everything is being done to guarantee your victory, and that these will not be free and transparent elections, and that's the reason why they won't be recognized, and there will be more sanctions. Do you really believe that this will happen, or these are just empty threats?
Well, first of all, these are unacceptable threats for any sovereign country in the world. It's completely unacceptable. Nobody should be able to interfere in the domestic affairs of a given country. Venezuela is a democratic country. There's no doubt of that. We are a sovereign state. We have our own political system, and there will be elections in Venezuela.
There will be elections. Some say that they will be postponed.
In Venezuela, there will be elections on Sunday, the 20th May. The people will vote. There will be a very large turnout, as big as in France and the United States.
Won't win.
I invite you to come to Venezuela to bear witness to the strongest electoral turnout in Venezuela, and bigger than in France or the United States or elsewhere, including in Colombia, many locations governed by the right, which don't have any slightest form of morality to call into question their political system.
What about if there are more sanctions by the European Union? What will you do? Will you continue to work?
Well, it's all the same to me. Sanctions, because this elite which is governing in Europe has in its mindset a superiority complex coming from colonialism.
Are they racist?
Yes, they are racist. It's a form of racism, social racism, which is the legacy of their superiority complex. They think that they're still dealing with their former colonies, the colonies which they used to govern. They still think they're masters of these countries. We're already free in the 21st century. All the same to me. I don't care one whit for foreign public opinion.
Next, if you win the elections, will you revoke the National Assembly?
The idea which was floated to me seems to be a very good one. Now, as of June, well, there'll be the revocatory right which will emerge. The people can come together or collate signatures or garner signatures to deal with some parliamentarians to the right who've really failed.
I'd like to talk now about the economic situation. You have increased the minimum wage since 2013, 20 times, but for the lives of people, there hasn't been much change because there is 13,000% inflation.
Where did you pull this figure from? 13,000%?
It comes from the International Monetary Fund.
The IMF does nothing to do with the situation in Venezuela. They're just
So are they
hitmen.
only lies? We don't have any national statistics on inflation.
Of course there are statistics available. You've got the Central Bank of Venezuela, which has statistics. You can't buy everything or think of everything that IMF provides you. If you have to think about it, you drill down in depth. They are against our model, against the Bolivarian revolution, because it's an alternative system to that of the IMF. Nothing that the IMF says about Venezuela is credible.
So they're all lies.
Yes, all lies. Of course, there is inflation, but it is induced inflation. The product of an attack against the exchange rate system, against the national currency. We have been victims. Well, in fact, I had to effect a monetary reconversion because we've been victims of something which had already been done against other revolutionary change processes in Latin America, the physical theft of Venezuelan money to create internal chaos in the buying system, in the payment system, in the general system trade. So I had to decree a form of monetary reconversion which will be activated on the 4th of June as part of measures which will be anti-inflationary and as part of measures required for the country's stability.
But we can say that the situation, the economic situation, is very bad. Some even say it's catastrophic. Same thing for oil. The price of oil is higher today than in 2014. But given that the production capacity of oil in Venezuela has fallen by so much, Venezuela can't benefit from this. This is the reason why many people say that the situation is catastrophic and that you are responsible for this.
Well, you need to be aware that we have an empire operating against us.
But you can't put all the blame on the American
Well,
empire.
that's your opinion. It's not mine, but you're asking me questions I'm answering.
I'd like to have your opinion. That's why I'm asking questions.
Well, that was my opinion. I let you ask me questions. I give you my answers. Of course, we've got economic problems, like all other countries. Now, we're looking into this, and we resolve these problems, and we're doing it gradually. We're going to sort things out. Of course, we've got a major economic potential here. We have our own model, indeed, but we are subject to a major war on two fronts, and from the imperialist forces, the United States, and the oligarchs in Venezuela who don't like the fact they lost the election.
Now I'd like to talk about the humanitarian situation. It would seem that there are health problems, the rise in the infant mortality rates, people who don't have enough food, people are going hungry, an increase in epidemics such as diphtheria, which had been eradicated in the past. Do you refuse to talk about a humanitarian crisis? Why?
Why are you saying that I haven't talked about this or haven't admitted this?
In the past, you denied those facts.
But show me where I said this.
When you spoke to the Organization of American States in 2016...
That's not true. I forgive you, but it's not true. You're poorly informed. Don't be seduced by misinformation. Thousands of people follow those forms of media and who are misinformed about Venezuela's situation. The story of diphtheria and measles is not true. We're vaccinating the whole population free of charge, children, adults, against all illnesses that can be dealt with by vaccination. Now, I can tell you it is true. We've had sourcing problems, supply problems, but no more so than in Colombia, where misery has reached 55%. Now, in terms of food, Venezuela is developing policies, unique policies, and this is how we have been able to put into place a program which has enabled us to maintain the appropriate food level or the supply of food for the population.
But there is a problem. Apparently, the Venezuelans are fleeing their country. People even say over 1 million people have left the country.
You're a conservative, aren't you?
The United Nations are saying that there's a migration crisis.
Where did the United Nations say this? It's not true. It's just not true. Colombia and the Colombian government, Mr. Santos and the outgoing government are all part of this permanent campaign against Venezuela. And he invented the story according to which about 1,500,000 Venezuelans have left our country and gone to Colombia.
The Red Cross has confirmed this. Over 1,500,000 people have fled.
Well, I don't know. You've got your information, you've got your data, you believe into it, but I'm not so sure about what you're saying.
I don't know what your sources of information, what's your analysis? Are the Venezuelans leaving their country or not?
Colombia. Colombia itself, there is an internal agency there which gathers statistics on internal immigration. It's just published data on Colombians who've emigrated, which corresponds to the trend over the last few years with a slight increase. There are 200,000 Venezuelans in Colombia currently, but it's not the French media or the media of the United States who are saying so. But I can tell you Venezuela is hosting 5,600,000 Colombians who are now in Venezuela.
The past was only yesterday.
5,600,000. How can you, in your analysis, deal with this? 5,600,000 people in a given country and say it's the past who are working, 5,600,000 Colombians working in Venezuela who enjoy the same rights as Venezuela.
On that point, you're right.
If you look at the Santos government in Colombia, they've talked about the 1 million Colombians who've come to live here, are fleeing poverty, misery, war. People don't ever mention that, just reiterating this campaign of denigration. Now, I can tell you that Venezuela, that the level of immigration has increased, as in many countries.
So there's no migration crisis in your country?
There is no migration crisis. There isn't one. People have tried to create one, but this campaign, this very against us, this media campaign, it's the contrary. We're bringing back comrades. Comrades are coming back to our country. They went abroad and they realized how beautiful our country was. And this is all part of this very negative campaigns where people say Venezuela is chaotic, there's no order. There's order in Venezuela. There's a sense of direction. There's a national strategy, a national project. We've made major progress. There's a great deal of hope in the new constitution and the new alternative society, an alternative to neoliberal capitalism.
I'd like to ask you a question, because you have been accused of receiving funds for your election campaign from the Albrecht company. You have never shed any light or responded to those accusations. $30 million to finance your campaign, given by this Brazilian company.
For which campaign?
The presidential election in 2013. And this is an extract from a file of a Brazilian investigation.
Well, let's take a look at that. If there is something you cannot reproach me is to be somebody's corrupted or being a bandit. I've never needed, I will never need the money of Odebrecht, and I've never needed so in my life. The focus of my life is not material wealth. The focus of my life is a cause, the cause of Venezuela, with deep spiritual, moral roots. People can say what they want. You can accuse me of what you want. But those forms of criticisms, that just concerns the people who issue them.
One last question on the Middle East. Are you afraid that Mr. Trump is in the process of preparing for a new war in Iran, in Palestine? Are you afraid that Mr. Trump will be able to create a lot of problems in that part, not only in that part of the world, but in the Middle East in general?
Well, what I believe is that the United States finds itself in a state of strategic decline, in a period of strategic decline where they've shown a form of permanent improvisation. It's all false, these attacks against Syria, they're all false, these fake chemical weapons factories. We saw that it was all untrue, and everybody remains silent. Nobody is saying anything, and this has demonstrated the immorality of the foreign policy of the United States. Permanent improvisation with which they address their foreign policy. They're aiming currently, they're targeting the Middle East to create a major conflict. Fortunately, the Islamic Republic of Iran is very strong, very robust, a very clear foreign policy, and I'm convinced that they will manage to overcome the threats of the United States and preserve peace in their country and in the region. I believe that ultimately we are witnessing a seminal moment in history. Latin America is moving as well.
But the right is winning almost everywhere.
Perhaps this is just a one-off cycle, but in Latin America there's a new wave of change.
It would seem that the current wave shows that the left is losing out.
Well, I think there's a real solidity here which has never existed beforehand. The existence of l'ALBA, the governments of the left in a broad swathe of Latin America and South America, the strength of the Bolivarian Revolution and the Cuban Revolution, all this has let us have a glimpse of a new wave of support from the people. The people won't tolerate what's happened over here, what's happened in Argentina. 70% of people disapprove of President Macri in Argentina following his announcement that he will get help from the IMF. Do you think that Brazil will remain docile, will accept Lula to be convicted? If there were elections today, Lula would have a landslide victory. If there were elections today in Argentina, the people will kick out Macri. So let's wait for better times for Latin America, because they will come.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for having given us this interview, this exclusive interview. Thank you very much for having watched it.
Yeah, Marc Perelman there speaking with Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro. We're talking about it in the company of our panel artist and photographer Cristobal Ochoa, Eva Gollinger, Venezuelan-American lawyer and journalist who joins us from New York, and from Chicago, Daniel Landsberg, who teaches at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. Daniel, how does the president of Venezuela seem to you 4 days before that election?
Well, that was a lot to take in. The beauty of the type of conspiratorial narrative that the Venezuelan government has really clung to throughout the years is that whenever they get information that it would in any way be negative for the government, then whoever supplies that information is just added into the conspiracy. And we saw that a little bit with the Red Cross getting brought up as having confirmed the mass exodus of Venezuelans across the Colombian border. We now, oh, well, you have your figures, the Red Cross is in on it too. And with that sort of rhetoric, any sort of criticism can be basically muted ex ante, because you're essentially attacking the source and just piling on the sources. I saw in the interview there a level of certitude which I think is completely appropriate for a man who knows without a shadow of a doubt that he is about, despite 20% approval ratings, to win a presidential election on his own terms, having exiled any credible opposition beforehand and basically secured, moved up the elections, and secured that the only certainty Venezuela truly has is that Maduro will be re-elected on the 20th. What happens on the 21st is an open question. And I think that's what has many Venezuelans nervous today.
What happens on the 21st? Eva Gollinger, you agree?
Well, I think certainly that was a exhaustive interview. Maduro, as usual, very optimistic. That's because generally he's not grounded in reality. It happens to be, knowing him very well, that's how he is, it's who he is. He chooses not to see what's beyond his circle of vision, which is precisely the way that he set it up. I'm someone who supported Hugo Chavez, very deeply, but definitely have not supported this government. The depths of corruption that I've seen, of criminality at the highest levels, have been really mind-blowing that this is going on for so long. And now surrounding this election, I certainly think it's accurate that most likely he will win. I think it's unfortunate that any opposing candidates and movements have been unable to come together, because it certainly would be a moment of mass discontent in the country, of economic crisis that's undeniable, despite what Maduro may say, and humanitarian crisis, for a change in the country. But, the situation is as it is. And certainly, the Maduro government has done everything within its power to crush any dissent, and that includes within its own movement, or what is considered to be Chavismo. There's a large portion that does not support him or most of his policies, but certainly doesn't support the opposition, and they feel like there's nowhere to go. People don't want to lose their benefits or services. Many have been threatened. Any kind of critics, including myself, we receive death threats, all kinds of things from high-level officials within the Maduro government. So it's hard to be a critic in Venezuela, being on the opposition or coming from within Chavismo. And I think that for some, the status quo seems as though it's the only option. And then, of course, there is some truth to some of the things that Maduro has said in that interview regarding external threats. Some of it is conspiratorial, but some is grounded in reality. The Trump administration, the U.S. government doesn't hide its contempt for Venezuela. They've called openly for regime change. They've imposed sanctions. And I think it's accurate that when Maduro says that the international community is non-exclusive to the U.S. and Europe, he's correct. Venezuela will have the support of Asia, of China, of Russia, of Iran. It will continue to have support of major powers throughout the world. They will not follow in the footsteps of the U.S. and Europe. So, he feels like he's on solid ground. He has clients to sell his whatever products, of oil that they're producing, or those who will invest in the country. So, there are those who will continue to prop up his government and who believe that at some point, something will give, but they want to be the ones who get their hands on Venezuela oil resources and not behave in the same fashion as the U.S. or some of its European allies have.
All right, we're going to talk about those oil resources in a moment. So consensus there between Eva and Daniel about, well, A, that Maduro is going to win the election on Sunday now, and B, that the country is in a poor state. Cristobal Ochoa, you arrived in France a little less than 1 year ago. You obtained political asylum in this country last September. You got a phone call, you say, one day telling you were on a political police list.
Yes, I have been working as a photographer in the protest, and also I have made certain things in the protest, like receiving things to give to the doctors in the streets, and I help a lot in the streets in the protest. I also make political activism in a creative way. I support pacific ways to protest against the government. Right. I was against.
And that's what got you put on the list.
Yeah.
You came with those bills when you arrived. Again, you arrived You came last June. How much were the bills worth then, and how much are they worth now?
Okay. Well, when I arrived, it was like €5.
€5?
Yes.
How many are in that pile?
Here are like
at least
50,000 bolivars.
Right.
And when I came out of Venezuela, it was €5, and I could pay like 10 foods in the street. 10. But now it's you cannot buy almost nothing with this. The things are so expensive right now. The people is starving.
Yeah, we heard Marc Perelman, who's just back, saying people don't even use money anymore. They borrow.
Yeah, there is not cash in the street because it's too much. The money that the people needs to buy things and to move. The public transport is non-existent because the bus drivers doesn't have money to change
to give change to the passengers there.
Yes, not the change to the los repuestos. To fix the buses and yes, thank you, Eva. Yeah. And the people is the minimum salary is nothing for them. You cannot buy almost nothing. So my work as an artist is it was to make the people get not frustrated in their fights.
To raise their spirits.
Yes, to raise the spirits and to show other face of the protest to the world. Because
right now there isn't much in the way of protests. We have a splintered opposition, and
the people is
Daniel Landsberg was asking the question. We know it's going to happen May 20th. What happens May 21st?
The people is depressed. The people is disappointed with our leaders, our opposition leaders, and the people doesn't know what to do. There is a lot of confusion in the streets, and the people, most of the people, thinks these elections are fake elections. I think it's a fake election, of course. It's a way to.
So they're just resigned to the fact that this is happening, and they're dejected about it.
Yes.
After speaking to France 24, Nicolas Maduro flying to the city of Carabobo for a campaign rally. There he told his supporters that his government had nationalized the Kellogg's factory and will operate it, quote, in the hands of the working class. This after the U.S. maker of, 75% of Venezuela's breakfast cereal announced it was suspending its operations in the country and laying off the 300 workers in the central city of Maracay because of the current economic and social deterioration. The fact that Kellogg's isn't selling its famous cereals anymore. Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, what does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that Kellogg's staying power was actually quite a good deal higher than that of many multinationals, which have been fleeing Venezuela, and rightly so. I worry a little bit that in the long goodbye of Maduro, a very important point will be lost. Which I was reminded by what Eva was saying just now. I'm not used to being on the same side as her, and I welcome her to criticizing Maduro. That said, there's a sense in which what happened with Maduro cannot be isolated from what happened under Hugo Chavez. Maduro was a continuation of Chavez's policies. And to create a false dichotomy, a little bit like what happened among some segments of the European left with sort of the good Lenin, bad Stalin idea, the actual framework of governance that Maduro has been able to bend to his will, to be able to stage phony elections like the one that's going to be held this weekend, to be able to create a fake parliament when he loses the parliament of the country, to be able to dictate what happens and who is an enemy of the state, being able to make sure that all of the opposition gets exiled. Those powers were hollowed out, not under Maduro, but under Hugo Chavez Frias.
Right, but it was, but it wasn't under Chavez that the Constitution was changed.
Well, it was changed under Chavez early on, but that was a very different process.
It wasn't just done on Chavez. It was done through a process of involvement of nationwide, where people participated in an open and democratic way, not the way that it was done last year under Maduro, where it was pushed through in a very illegitimate fashion, and then those were actually fake elections where there was fraud. The numbers were inflated at the end. And ever since then, I mean, the electoral process in Venezuela, unfortunately, has now been compromised, because Venezuela did have a very solid electoral process that was quite transparent. I mean, I voted there over 8 times as a Venezuelan citizen when I lived there, and it was much better than the United States. But ever since last year, when they inflated the numbers, they did away with the audits. There was no opposition. to provide any kind of checks and balances in the process. And then again, in last, I think it was December, when they had regional elections, there was absolute fraud that took place in one of the states, and it just was left that way. So obviously, this time around, people would feel as though the elections are fake or could be fraudulent. And at this stage, since there's been no change in the Electoral Council composition, there's been no other guarantees put in place. There's outright vote buying. There's voter intimidation. There are now, ID cards that the government uses to provide benefits to Venezuelan citizens that now they're saying they have to, check in with when they vote, so they make sure that they're voting to get their benefits. I mean, those types of things did not exist under Chavez. And in fact, he was adamant that he was against that kind of culture. And he did away with a lot of corrupt practices that, unfortunately, I mean, I would agree that there were tendencies that were authoritarian that opened the door to what we have today. But the type of behavior that Maduro engages in with this type of authoritarianism, intimidation tactics, and absolute erosion of the democratic institutions has been his doing, and those of a corrupt circle that have kept him in power, and of a poor populace that is now, has lost all of the legitimacy and the power and the participatory practices that they had gained under Chavez. Much of that is now gone. And what we have are people who are desperate to just maintain, whatever benefits they possibly have so that they can get by each day. And if that means, continuing with this government, that's what people will do, because as of now, the opposition is not offering any kind of solid alternative.
Yeah, and on that score...
But it's important to note that that
Daniel
corrupt
Landsberg.
circle you mentioned, that corrupt circle you mentioned was not brought together initially by Nicolas Maduro. They were brought together by Hugo Chavez. And now to be able to hold on to power, to be able to stave off impunity a little bit longer, you have basically the sort of core group that many of whom thrived under Chavez and first rose to prominence under him, protecting Maduro. And yes, I agree that Chavez did not necessarily have the same storybook villain, bad guy in an Asterix comic facets that we do see with Nicolas Maduro. But the scenario, the ability to bend a country completely to his will, to expel people whenever he wants, to force Venezuelans essentially to go without food, to go without medicine, that's something that was not created by Maduro. It was inherited by him.
I disagree.
Absolutely. Chavez did not engage in those similar activities. And I would just want to add that...
He didn't have to.
Most
Oil
of the
was at 120 when Chavez died.
Most of the honest politicians that were in Chavez's government left after Chavez passed away because they refused to remain with Maduro, or else they were forced out because they were calling him out on his bad practices, his mismanagement of the economy, and the internal corruption. And I think what we see now,
like
and I know because I was deeply involved and close to this government.
Who are these politicians who left?
Excuse me, I'm trying to finish my statements instead of you speaking over me, is that, many of the people that Chavez actually ousted from his government, Maduro has brought back. And those are the ones who are in leadership positions today. And they do run a very corrupt circle that I would say is engaging in high-level criminal activity.
I want to talk about something
and that's very unfortunate.
Daniel Landsberg just mentioned, which is important, which is the price of oil. We're talking about the nation that sits on the world's largest known reserves of crude petroleum. And on that score, with the price now rebounding, there is the wonder, could the fortunes of Maduro change? This graph that we're showing you is a surprising one. It shows that percentage of imports of oil. Venezuela imports oil. And the Reuters news agency reports that the government is sticking with its Bolivarian creed by importing oil that it's bought nearly $440 million worth of foreign crude and shipped it directly to Cuba on friendly credit terms, often at a loss. The purchases coming as Venezuela's production has hit a 33-year low in the first quarter of this year. That's down 28% over the last 12 months. Refineries operating at 1/3 of capacity. Daniel Landsberg, the country's in economic meltdown, and yet they're going the extra mile to be able to help out Cuba. Why is that?
Well, basically, it stems from Venezuela's increased isolation. When I believe Eva mentioned earlier that Venezuela still had some modicum of support internationally, countries like China and Russia. One of the things that was missing was countries in the New World. Venezuela, which was a middle-income, mid-sized country that was able to punch outside its weight class under Chavez. For over a decade, it was able to set the agenda in Latin America. It had all of these allied powers, now is more and more isolated. Either because of elections that have brought the right to power, as was mentioned during the interview with President Maduro, but also because even some of the more left-wing governments, for example, Ecuador, have now tacked more towards a neoliberal model out of necessity, because I would say that Nicolas Maduro, despite his beliefs, has done more to damage the cause of the left in Latin America than any other person, including Donald Trump, including any other right-wing dictator or U.S. president that he might mention. Venezuela
in the
has
last
gone from
couple of
cautionary
years,
tale to disaster.
Daniel, in the last couple of years, the price of oil has been at rock bottom. Now it's surging past $70 a barrel. Could this be?
It can't help him.
Can this be a buoy for Maduro? Can this be a salvation for Venezuela's economy?
I think oil could go back to 120, as it was during some of the latter Chavez era, and at this point, Venezuela is too far gone. PDVSA hasn't been able to put any money into its own operations. It has been basically working on a shoestring budget when it comes to things like finding new wells, like running maintenance on existing infrastructure, refineries. It has refineries in Bonaire and Curacao, which are very important to PDVSA's ability to export, which are in the process of getting seized because of old ICSID awards for nationalizations undertaken, I might add, under the Chavez era that Venezuela never paid off, and now the clock has run out on those. And on top of that, Venezuela had been able to stave off to some extent the collapse of its oil industry until quite recently by virtue of using joint ventures, of having foreign companies like ConocoPhillips that were working in Venezuela basically on equal terms with PDVSA, and basically outsourcing the management and, most importantly, the recapitalization of these projects to those companies. But the recent crackdown in the last year by an ever more paranoid and mercurial Maduro administration has now made those companies leave. And while Kellogg's leaving is terrible, I remember eating breakfast cereals in Venezuela with Tony El Tigre, and it was a huge part of the breakfast culture there. A much bigger problem is the fact that the foreign multinationals that have been propping up a modicum of that oil industry are now very, very scared, and they're looking for reasons to get out.
Well, Chevron
and the more that you have them gone,
I said Chevron remains. I mean, there are some that still do remain in Venezuela that remain invested. But I agree. I think that the oil industry has collapsed, and so no matter what the price is, because in fact under Chavez, oil prices began much lower, and he was still able to enact successful social programs and, grow the economy instead of this disaster situation that we have under Maduro. So I don't think it matters what price the oil barrel is at with this government. There is so much rampant corruption and mismanagement that I don't think that it is recoverable at this stage under this present administration.
Which brings us to the question of what the other nations in the region will do. On Monday, the Lima Group club of foreign ministers convened in Mexico City. 12 nations calling, as they put it, for the last time on the Venezuelan government to suspend the general election.
Membership in the Americas only exists if it is a democracy. Our struggle as a whole is to help Venezuelans recover their democracy.
Eva Gollinger, your reaction to the words of Argentina's foreign minister?
As I said, I would think we'd look back to what Maduro said in his interview. I don't think he cares what anyone in the region who is opposed to him says. I don't think it will have any impact on his belief that he can continue to govern Venezuela. Venezuela will continue to be isolated in the region. It is losing its allies. but I don't think that that will in any way hinder Maduro, from moving forward with the policies that he's been putting into place.
Let's take a look at how, again, as we look ahead with on the rebounding on what we've just heard, Cristobal, perhaps we can call up some of the photos that you took during those demonstrations last year. They were demonstrations where there was a stiff crackdown. Dozens of people were killed across the country. And in your pictures, we see, well, the image of a vibrant nation. And there's a sense that, like, look at this one, for instance, taken with kind of a fish-eyed lens there of all those demonstrators. Where was this picture taken?
This picture taken in Caracas in one of the 100 demonstrations we made. And I took the pictures with my cell phone because it's very dangerous for us to have a camera. And well, I just make the pictures with a simple phone.
What's happening in this one?
Well, this the last one was protest I promote. Is a different kind of protest. I say the people in the lines to put their hands up to protest against the government. Because in that moment, if you have something in your hands, you could go to jail easily for protest in the lines. You cannot protest against the government, and they try to put fear in the people. So I try to make this activism. I go to Barquisimeto, it's another city in Venezuela, and I promote this different way to protest. And the other picture we saw is the other. We were with T-shirts with a very important phrase for us, because it was
Tell us the phrase in Spanish.
Pude haber sido yo.
Which means?
It means it could be me. My English is not so well, but it's in past, and it says it was said by this one. It was said by the son of a very powerful Chavez man, Tarek William Saab, the son. He was on one of these protests, and one of his friends has been killed by a tear gas bomb. And he said this in...
it could have been me.
Yeah, it could have been me that. Please stop, and please say to your people to stop this repression.
So what should the international community do at this point? Because if you impose sanctions on a country which is in economic meltdown, that's only going to hurt ordinary citizens, right?
Well, we are trying to have the international support, or a lot of we can do different, because we don't know what to do, because the government have the control of everything, and we only have the international support to, I don't know, to make pressure and to make the government feel the economic sanctions maybe, and to make to change his. For example, right now we are having the support of the a lot of countries to say to stop these elections. These elections are totally fake. This is totally controlled by the government, and we don't have a representation. Henry Falcón is not the representation of opposition.
So splintered opposition. Daniel Landsberg, how do you how do you break the impasse? Who do you turn to for peaceful change?
So I think that the idea that the international community can't play a role, I think that right now it's the effects of what the international community can do are limited for various geopolitical reasons. But I do think that that may change. You have a prospect of a right-wing government coming to power in Colombia. You have a strong prospect of either a far-right or a center-right government coming to power in Brazil, which are Venezuela's two most important neighbors, and which are suffering through massive immigration waves that both countries are ill-positioned to handle. And right right now, because of election season, no one's really talking about that. But when a new administration comes into place, that issue, I think, will be increasingly front and center. And as that crisis for Brazil and for Colombia becomes more and more a part of what is being discussed there, the likelihood that Maduro's conspiratorial rhetoric will create confrontations with the neighbors is going to skyrocket. And traditionally in Latin America, those sorts of situations have sometimes gotten out of control and proved very destabilizing in a way that the Grupo de Lima or even the U.S. sanctions up until now have not been. I think that what this election will do is not lead to a change in government. There are amoeba on Jupiter who have a better chance of winning this election than either Henry Falcón or Bertucci do. Any of us on this panel do. You yourself do. That said, there is a strong chance that this election will be seen historically as the last chance Venezuela had for there to be some semblance of democratic process in the transition that was to follow.
All right, we'll see how it plays out. Unfortunately, Daniel Landsberg, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank you so much for joining us from Chicago.
So's the revolution, hopefully.
I want to thank Eva Gollinger for being with us from New York City, Cristobal Ochoa. Thank you for joining us here for this special edition of the France 24 debate.
Thank you.